in Luke's gospel, which was the baptism of Jesus. The baptism of Jesus, which you may remember, is found in all of the gospels. Today's gospel reading is only found in John. John begins Jesus' ministry at a wedding reception and reveals Jesus through a sign. On an interesting textual note, as I begin today's scripture, John's gospel includes Mary. We all know Mary as the mother of Jesus, as we have read the Gospels. As we read today's text, you'll notice John says, mother of Jesus. He never calls Mary by name. Friends, I wonder what other ways God will reveal new things to you in the reading of today's text. May we continue to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts as we turn to John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Let us now continue listening. On the third day was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine had given out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons of water. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servant who had drawn the water, he knew. The steward called the bridegroom and he said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, but then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk." But you have kept the wine until now. Jesus did this. It was the first sign in Cana of Galilee and revealed his glory. And through that, his disciples believed in him. Friends, this is the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. A father asked his 8-year-old son how Sunday school was that morning. And the boy said, "Our lesson was about when Jesus went to a wedding and how he made water into wine." And the father said, "Well, what did you learn in that story?" And the boy thought, and he thought, and there was silence for a while, and finally the boy said, "If you're having a wedding, you better invite Jesus." In those days, weddings were perhaps bigger and more grand than they are today. And there are lots of reality shows about weddings. The Discovery Network is filled with shows about weddings, from Bridezilla to I Met My Spouse, and 90 days later we got married. How those work, I don't know, but entertainment and people sure love it. In our text today, we see that the whole town is invited to the festivities of the wedding. Now, in our time, It is what? Tradition for the bride's side of the family to help offset the cost of the wedding. Can you imagine if you were Alan, stuck with the cost of a meal for the entire town that was there? And not just for one day, Alan, but for 7 whole days?
But that's how they do weddings in Romania.
That's how they still do them in Romania.
In the countryside, they invite the whole village, and actually everybody's getting together and they cook their own meals. So they only have to buy the ingredients, but then the whole village is going and help cooking.
So that's one way the whole community helps. In this way, it's not so bad, is it? In this way, it's implied in the text that not the bride's side of the family is responsible, but the groom's side of the family. You're off the hook, Alan. You don't have to worry about it. And the groom's side of the family is responsible for 7 days of food and beverages and appetizers and everything. This is where we find Jesus, his mother, and the disciples that are among the wedding guests in Cana. Cana is a little tiny town about 9 miles north of Nazareth. And I wish amongst all of the festivities that they tell us about, 7 days wedding that gives us an idea of the culture, that we knew something about the happy couple. We don't. We know that there was this grand occasion. And maybe in the life of that town, that was one of the biggest occasions they had experienced in a long time. 7 days of rest and excitement and food galore. How is it like in Romania?
It's feasting and feasting and feasting and feasting.
Feasting and feasting and feasting.
A lot of dancing and feasting.
Lots of dancing
And a lot of
feasting.
drinks.
And lots of drinks. Well, like the weddings of today, as the story unfolds, sometimes things don't go exactly the way we planned them to go. Even on what we hope to be our most perfect day ever, it doesn't always go right. Something goes amiss. And Mary informs Jesus that the wine supply, a key component of the celebration, of the dancing, a key component of the Jewish celebration, has been completely exhausted. Now, I'm thinking Jesus doesn't perhaps arrive right at the start of the celebration because he's not informed that it's running low. He's informed that it's exhausted. There is no more. The barrel is bone dry, or in this case, the wineskins are bone dry. I wonder, was Mary simply relaying the message, or was it a form of gossip? Can you believe they ran out of wine? That's a prayer request. Or was she more likely telling Jesus because she was embarrassed for this family? Because in that community, it was actually a crime. Disorderly conduct for the groom's family to run out of wine, because you're going to have a lot of upset people. They came, they expected to stay for 7 days, and by golly, you're supposed to feed them and give them everything they need. 3 points to ponder as we look at this text this morning. First is that Mary goes to Jesus. The wedding festivities were on the verge of collapse and ending. Everybody go home with their hands up in the air. The bride and the groom forever scorned. And Mary goes to Jesus as if she knows Jesus can remedy the situation. As if she expects him to go out and procure enough wine for all of these people. I'm thinking in that day, there's not a Walmart or a Carter's right down the street that Jesus can just go and order 900 bottles of wine. And even if there was, it's not likely that Carter's would have 900 bottles of wine sitting there. Maybe a couple hundred, but not that many. There's not a 7-Eleven down the street or a Circle K. The market would be far. Or perhaps she was expecting a miracle. When I look at this text, I wonder, do we go to Jesus? we lift up our concerns to God when our lives are overwhelmed? Do we go to Jesus? Do we embrace the fullness of our relationship, our benefits? We know a lot about benefits in the employment world, but the full benefits of Christianity that we receive, the ability to go to Jesus. Or do we allow anxiety and stress to prevail? Jesus responds, "Woman, what does this have to do with me?" Can you imagine a southern boy telling their mama, "Woman"? Can y'all imagine that? Well, this is one of the times where the Greek just doesn't do it justice as it's translated into English. And there's something that's lost there. It's sort of like, as one commentary said, if we were to translate heads up in English, many of us know that heads up does not mean stick your head up. In fact, it means something is coming at your head and you need to put it down. And those, perhaps Sheila, who did not grow up with a native English background, might be confused at saying such as heads up, thinking, well, that means you put your head up. But it's an idiom. And it was an idiom for ma'am. Respected term. John records Jesus' response to his mama as my hour has not yet come. It's not Jesus saying, no, I'm not going to help them. But it's John pointing to Jesus' ultimate mission in his death, resurrection, and ascension, and pointing to more signs that are to come. But what does this mama do? This mama turns to the kitchen servants and said, y'all listen to whatever he says. She turned to Jesus for help. And they listened. They listened as Jesus provided instructions. Second point to ponder, they listened as they take 6 massive jars. Our text says that would hold 20 to 30 gallons of water that were used for washing hands. Do we listen? Or maybe are we quick to respond in fear? We can't use those jars. Those jars are specific. They're set aside. Those jars are only for washing of hands. They can't be used in any other ways. We need to go get wineskins. Jesus, you can fill them with wineskins. See, God takes the ordinary and makes it something extraordinary. These kitchen servers, they were not bound by fear. They responded with back-breaking response of going and getting 20 to 30 gallons of water per jar and filling up 6 jars of water. Can you imagine wondering, okay, how's this going to work? But they went and they did it. As God stands among us, not as an observer who watches and says, this is not my business, but one with a strong desire to be in authentic, real relationship with us. Therefore, God is concerned about all the people's needs, even the fact that they have no wine in the midst of the festivities. I'm reminded of 1 Peter 5:7 that it says, cast all of your anxieties upon him because God cares for you. God cares about everything, all the way down to our needs, physical needs. But it's not just some of our cares, it's all of our cares. Some people casting your concerns to God is like casting a fishing line, though. You know, we cast that line out, and that fish doesn't bite real soon, so we got to roll it right back up. We got to try to cast it again. When we're called to cast our cares on God, we're called to cast and let it go. And that's contrary to what we know and understand and what we're taught. Casting requires bringing it to God, listening, and letting it go, which is the third point. Letting it go by trusting in God through faith. Because people can fill water jars, but only God can take water and turn it into wine. People do the ordinary, the commonplace, the normal activities, but God can touch it and make it into something that's amazing. God can give life and give flavor and fragrance and effect. So in verse 9, when the steward tasted that water, it had become wine, and he didn't know where it came from. What's amazing is from the moment that water was drawn to that moment it was tasted, a transformation happened. Jesus didn't do voodoo over it. Jesus didn't take grapes and break them up and put them in it. Jesus didn't take that new Kool-Aid stuff we have in a little squirt bottle and squirt it, and then it magically became. It was transformed through faith in the bringing of pulling it up, pouring it, and bringing it to. Letting it go, trusting in God. And then the steward asks, why did you do that? Why did you hold back? Why did you give the best last? Why didn't you give the best first? That's unheard of. Most people wait till people are intoxicated and they don't know the difference. But that's not how you operate. John lifts up that it took patience to wait until now. When we're told to trust, that means letting go and waiting. And that's not easy for us to do. Because when we trust and we let go, we're like, all right, God, I let go. Now I expect a response in 5 minutes. All right, God, it's been an hour. It's been a day. I let go. I expect that response.
But that's not how it works.
No. It was amazing how Jesus worked in the midst of imperfections. A wedding, again, the most perfect of days. What was supposed to be the most perfect of days and celebrations. A pastor once said, though, that weddings, in fact, are accidents waiting to happen because we put so much work and finances, stress, and thought into weddings. Months of planning and vast amount of money. It all comes down to one day. Now, I regret that I was not officially your pastor when Sheila got married, but I have heard some of the ways that you all came together in the kitchen and helped cook, and the flower arrangements and all that went into that, and other weddings that I have, in fact, officiated. We want everything to be perfect, but what is, in fact, a wedding? In our tradition, a wedding is, in fact, a service of worship. In our directory of worship, in our Book of Common Worship, a wedding is listed as a service of worship. In fact, I know an elder in a Presbyterian church in Mobile who got married on a Sunday morning because weddings are a part of worship. It's a response to what God does in our lives. And although that might sound a little different to us in our cultural ways, that's the way they started their lives. Yes, in our tradition, we're used to fixing our eyes on the bride and her lovely dress and the reaction as the bride comes down the aisle and her mate looks at her for the first time. At least that's my favorite part, to see how the reaction is in the dress. Is there going to be a tear? What's the reaction going to be? We love to fix our eyes on the couple on their first day as they're getting married. But sometimes in the midst of that perfect day, things become imperfect. Flower orders get mixed up. The perfect flowers accidentally, instead of getting put in the cooler, they get put in the freezer that are right next to it. So that when it's time for the flowers to get put in the flower girl's hair, and when it's time for the bride to get the bouquet, that beautiful bouquet that took hours for that florist to do is out in the southern humidity for just a minute and it turns brown. Sometimes on that perfect wedding day, the flower girl trips coming down the aisle, and she has her beautiful basket of petals, and those petals go everywhere.
That's not even that unfortunate. That the pastor said that your husband married your own husband.
The pastor says the wrong words. Our own clerk shared with me a story of a pastor who read the wrong liturgy at the service, who started out with the funeral liturgy instead of the wedding liturgy. Yes, the most perfect of days, preachers mess up. Everyone messes up because we put so much stress on making it perfect. Sometimes the bridal shop goes out of business right before the wedding, and the bride can't get her dress.
There's always a dress in China.
It's amazing. The preacher goes in the hospital the night before.
That's unfortunate.
The ceremony had concluded. The texts had been read, and the celebration had begun, as it says. But the worship service had not concluded. The Westminster Shorter Catechism says in its first question that what is the chief end of man? And the answer, to glorify God and worship God always. Worship doesn't stop when the preacher says, go into the world and love one another. It doesn't stop. The chief end of man is to glorify God and worship always. They were in the midst of this celebration. The wine had ran out, but the worship of God had not stopped. And in that most imperfect moment, where the world seemed like it was falling apart, I'm sure, to that bride and that groom, that's where God showed up in the midst. And that's where God still shows up in the midst. In the midst of the imperfect. Our Book of Order includes a powerful theological statement that says church ministry springs from worship, where God builds up the body of Christ through the gifts of the Holy Spirit. In the midst of worship is where gifts of God are brought and sent forth. As I said, worship doesn't stop. Our daily life, the activities that we do, are in fact worship. That celebration in itself was worship. We glorify God in the midst. The challenge is, how do we do that in the midst of imperfections on those wonderful days when you're frustrated, when you put so much energy and time? If you're in the business world, you've done a presentation, you've spent so much time and you're before a big client, maybe hours on this presentation, and the PowerPoint doesn't work. Maybe you spent so much time and energy going to various doctors' offices because you want a diagnosis, because you're frustrated, because your body's not doing what you think it should do, and the doctor's not there that day. Or in the case of one of my loved ones this week, they lost her biopsy after waiting all this time. And they can only guess what her true issue is because of a genetic background, because she's got some sort of Sicilian loved one from the Mediterranean. But if they could only find that biopsy, they would know for sure. But now she's got to wait the whole period again. In the midst of the imperfection world, God shows up in the midst and provides comfort and peace. The promise of our text today is that Jesus comes to fill us and fill us to the brim with living waters that is transformed into the fullness of celebration and joy, with grace and love that is lavished and abundant. It comes with the promise of new life and hope for restoration of all people. In the midst of the imperfection, God brings hope for all people. Jesus continues to come into our midst and our celebrations wherever they are, and therefore also in the midst of our disappointments, and leads us into deeper understanding and joy. And if we didn't have those disappointments, we wouldn't get to that new place of understanding and joy. So today we're asked, will we respond like the servants as Mary directed them? Will we do whatever Jesus tells us to do? Will we walk in faith? Will we trust Jesus and listen and let go? May we learn from the moments of imperfections, because in the midst, God's glory is revealed. Because that was the point of the sign. The first sign and miracle that we find in this text is God's glory was revealed. And it happened in the imperfection. Friends, this is the good news of God for us today. Thanks be to God.